Joseph Cotton.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really honored to be a part of this evening's tribute to a man I've known and loved for so many years. Aside from the astounding impact that Orson has had on the theater and motion pictures and, I suppose, almost all forms of show business, he is completely and absolutely responsible for aiding, abetting, and encouraging some of us to become actors. He has a lot to answer for. For example, he made us go on radio. He pushed us onto the stage of the Mercury Theater. And as if that were not enough, he literally shanghaied us to Hollywood to act in Citizen Kane. If it hadn't been for his interference, I could be very happily working in my uncle's bank on Sycamore Street in Petersburg. And I've never spoken before of this intrusion into my private life. But now that I have the opportunity, let me say this to you, Orson. Thank you very much.
Welcome to episode 35 of Film Gold, and this is part 4 of our deep dive into Citizen Kane. If you haven't heard the previous parts, I would recommend them, particularly part 3, because the first 2 parts of the series were the background to the film and the making of it, and then in part 3 I started going through the actual scenes of the film, so I really would listen to that first, and we're going to pick that up here in part 4. Just in case, a very, very quick recap. So Charles Foster Kane has inherited a lot of money. He's decided it'd be fun to run a newspaper, and he's embarked on a career of what was known then as yellow journalism. In England, where I come from, might be called tabloid journalism, sensationalism. And he's married the niece of the president of the USA, so everything's pretty rosy for him. He's about 35 maybe in the story at this point. The chronology is not perfect, but we can say more or less he's somewhat approaching middle age. He's still fairly youthful, but he's looking a little bit older, more mature than he was before. As we've seen in the scenes of this film already, it's a very non-linear type of storytelling. We have things from various parts of his life and people flashing back from various years to look back at things that have happened in his story. The MacGuffin, the slight red herring of the story, is that there's a reporter, Thompson, trying to find out what Kane's final word, Rosebud, meant. We flash forward now from the scene where Kane was going off with his new bride, and we are back in one sense. We're forward in the story, but we're back to Bernstein as an old man. And another of the themes of the film, as the story gets a bit darker and as Kane's life gets worse, is this idea of loss. So Bernstein says, this Rosebud...
Maybe that was something he lost. Mr. Kane was a man who lost almost everything he had.
He then sends Thompson to see Jedediah Leland, the Joseph Cotton character, now as an old man in a retirement home. And this is the last time I'm going to mention the wake-up. The makeup here is terrible for Joseph Cotton. But anyway, he's got a perfect craggy voice, and he's wearing a visor, which I quite like, but George Carlin famously didn't like visors and did a whole rant about them.
What the fuck is the point in wearing half a hat? Either get a hat or don't. No one's interested in the top of your head. Go back to the store and tell them to give you the rest of the hat. They cheated you.
Leland is quite bitter about Kane. I mean, he mentions the decline of Kane's marriage to Susan. Again, we're being told what's about to happen in the story. It's a very unusual way of telling a story, but there you go. He says that Kane behaved like a swine and that Leland was his stooge. Now, the killer line here, Leland says, he never believed in anything except Charles Foster Kane. But Leland seems like a fairly sympathetic guy, generally. And he says he wasn't all bad. Now, in this scene, his eyes were too bright. Joseph Cotton, as a young man, his eyes were too bright. So he wore contact lenses filled with milk. So there's a bit of suffering for his art there, as Orson Welles was also doing, and probably others as well. I guess that would play fairly well. If you're an old man, you're going to be in some discomfort anyway. You're probably going to have permanent aches and pains. Right, then we dissolve to a famous scene, the breakfast table montage. This is one of the few scenes that I did talk about quite a bit earlier. So we get 6 scenes depicting the peak and decline of Kane's marriage to Emily Norton. In a nutshell, he's too busy at the newspaper, and he also attacks her uncle, the President of the USA, in his papers. She says, sometimes I prefer a rival of flesh and blood. In a way, she'd almost prefer if it was another woman rather than the newspaper. It's an interesting scene. I mean, some critics of this film, and there are people who just don't like this film, probably because so many other people like it. They just want to attack it. But they say this is a lazy way to bring the story forward, however long it is, 15 years, I think. But it's also very clever. It starts off in the first breakfast scene with Kane saying, oh, I adore you. And then Emily is quite jokingly saying, what time did you get back from the paper? They're still quite friendly, but then it just gets slightly more bitter.
Charles, do you know how long you kept me waiting last night while you went to the newspaper for 10 minutes? What do you do in a newspaper in the middle of the night?
Emily, my dear? Oh, Emily, I don't spend that much time on the newspaper.
It isn't just the time. It's what you print. Attacking the president.
You mean Uncle John?
I mean the president of the United States.
He's still Uncle John. He's still a well-meaning fathead who's
Charles.
letting a pack of high-pressure crooks run his administration. This whole oil scandal.
He happens to be the president, Charles, not you.
That's a mistake that will be corrected one of these days.
Your Mr. Bernstein sent Junior the most incredible atrocity yesterday, Charles. I simply can't have it in the nursery.
Mr. Bernstein is apt to pay a visit to the nursery now and then.
Does he have to?
Yes.
Really, Charles? People will think...
What I tell them to think.
But it's not that obvious. It's just the very last scene. Kane has started to look more serious, and he's got kind of a furrowed brow. He's lost that youthful vigour. And the telling shot really is the last one, with them at either end of the table reading rival newspapers. So Kane's reading his own newspaper, The Inquirer. Emily's reading The Chronicle. I think it's pretty clever. And, it goes by pretty quickly. The first time you're watching this film, you're not going to be looking out for these details. I think it works quite well. We cut back to Leland. This is as an old man still. He did everything for love. He wanted the voters to love him too. I'm going to mention John Lennon here as well. One of John Lennon's famous quotes was, I'm only famous because of my repression. And he had a theory that people who become famous are the ones who need it the most, who didn't get enough love from their parents. That was obviously one of John Lennon's core beliefs, particularly when he did Primal Therapy, that most people don't get enough parental love, so they look for substitutes. So we get this idea here that Kane is looking for love from the masses. And of course, everything comes back to what happened to him when he was 8, when he was basically sold off by his parents. So you can see why he would have some scar tissue. Leland says he just didn't have any love to give. So he's doing it all for love. He wants people to love him, but he doesn't really have any genuine love to give back to others. This is about the middle part of the film, so you might call this part 2, really. I know we talk of 3-act structures in stories, but what Leland has said there is basically introducing now the decline of Kane's life. Now, it's not all bad to begin with. The next scene is middle-aged Kane. I'm going to guess he's about 50 now, meeting Susan Alexander, who is supposed to be 21, I think, early 20s. She's got a toothache. We first see him covered in mud and water. I think a car's just gone past and splashed him. There's a bit of comedy element there. She's laughing at him. And then they go back to her flat And he makes her laugh by wiggling his ears and making bird shapes with his hands. And you can imagine Orson Welles would be good at this. He's probably great with kids. I hate to say, though, judging from one of the biographies I read, he's probably better with other people's kids than his own. And there's another John Lennon parallel. If you watch the scene in Magical Mystery Tour when he's playing with this little kid, a little girl called Nicola, he's absolutely amazing with her. But he couldn't do that with Julian. He did do it with Sean to some extent, but not with his first son. But yeah, Orson Welles is clearly one of these guys who knew a lot of tricks, be they magic tricks or just other things to make you laugh. Kane here at 50, he likes the attention, and when they show close-ups, it's quite interesting because obviously you've got to keep remembering that this is Orson Welles at 25 in reality. But it works well in the story because when you're looking at the middle-aged Kane, he's made up to look middle-aged, but he's still got the youthful glint in his eye. He's not wearing the contact lenses with milk. I think he does later on, but he's not doing that here. So you get this nice sense with the middle-aged Kane that there is still that person still in there somewhere, but he's getting a bit jaded. Always remember that also when Welles was in radio, he famously was doing a lot of radio jobs, a lot of gigs, and again, taking him at his word, I don't believe everything he says, to be honest, but anyway, he said that he would sometimes have to play like an 80-year-old Chinaman on the radio at short notice. He had this ability, and when I was at drama school, there was a girl there she was only, I think, 19. I was a bit older, but most of the others were roughly that age. And she had this amazing knack for playing older women. They didn't bother with the makeup. I think there was one play we did where this girl was, I think the older woman had a hat on, so you couldn't see her face clearly, but it's the way she moved. I remember the drama teacher saying, that's West End level acting of a young person playing the part of an older person. She just knew how to move like an older person. We also have this idea, I think, of Orson Welles as a kind of old soul. It's this illusion that he was almost born with lots of experience already, like he'd been here before, that kind of thing. And that comes from having experiences and having extreme experiences. And obviously Orson Welles lost both his parents at a young age. So there was that sense of loss in Orson Welles as well. So in the scene, Susan, he's happy with the attention, but she is as well because he's willing to listen to her singing. She's singing and playing the piano. I think it's fair to say her voice is okay. She'd probably do okay just singing at a party. But what Kane envisaged for her is just beyond her. I mean, she's out of her depth. We'll see that all later. Kane says in this scene, I think we're both lonely, and he talks about going to a warehouse in search of my youth to collect his mother's clothes. So I think his mother has just died in the story. They quickly start an affair. It's not made clear, but, we can put two and two together. Now, the next scene, I think we do cut back to Leland again, who's about 50 years old. And I think Joseph Cotten looks fantastic as middle-aged Leland. It's just as elderly Leland. It doesn't quite work. They do another little scene where Joseph Cotton's standing in a car with a crowd around him. I can't remember if it's reporters or supporters. And there's lots of Kane for governor signs. Kane is obviously running for governor of New York. So they do this device that they've used already. Joseph Cotton as Leland starts reciting the speech, and then we cut to Kane taking over the speech in mid-sentence. And there's a large poster of him that was actually used as the cover poster for Citizen Kane for a long time. Even when I got the film out on VHS, it was still the main poster of him with the hat. Now, note, William Randolph Hearst also ran for governor, so there's a direct tie-in. There's echo on the soundtrack again. You get another idea of a cavernous building, and it's shot from a very interesting angle as well. Kane is apparently running as a fighting liberal, so he still wants to believe that he's in touch with the common man. And I notice in the speech and in these scenes, there's lots of what they call ad hominem attacks on his rival for the governorship, who's Jim Geddes, who's played by another Mercury actor, Ray Collins. Just in case you don't know, ad hominem is when you attack someone's character rather than, in this case, their policies. I mean, I don't know if that was normal then. I've been told that politics was probably a bit more friendly, not too friendly, but a bit friendlier in the early part of the 20th century. Now it's just so normal just to use these ad hominem attacks.
There is only one man who can rid the politics of this state of the evil domination of boss Jim Geddes.
Hooray!
I am speaking of Charles Foster Kane, the fighting liberal, the friend of the working man, the next governor of this state, who entered upon this campaign
with one purpose only, to point out and make public the dishonesty, the downright villainy of boss Jim W. Geddes' political machine, now in complete control of the government of this state. I made no campaign promises, because until a few weeks ago, I had no hope of being elected. Now, however, I have something more than a hope. And Jim Geddes has something less than a chance. Every straw vote, every independent poll shows that I'll be elected. Very well then. Now I can afford to make some promises.
There's still a little bit touch of the Kane humour here. He said, I'd make my promises now if I wasn't too busy arranging to keep them. As I said earlier, there's a running theme of promises, keeping promises or not keeping them. It's mentioned 4 or 5 times, I think, in total in the film. Then we get a shot of Geddes, this rival, watching from a balcony, and this is another one where multiple elements were involved. So they're mixing life-size and miniatures, and then it's all fed into an optical printer, which is quite revolutionary for those times. Now, we don't know yet that Geddes has discovered Kane's affair with Susan Alexander and presumably told Emily. Charles and Emily's son is there watching the speech, and Kane is nice to his son, and his son seems like he's kind of hero worshipping his dad, which is natural enough. Emily sends him home, the son, and then tells Kane, I'm going to this address, do you want to come with me? And it's obviously Susan Alexander's address. Kane agrees to come with her. They walk to her apartment, and then Geddes, the political rival, appears. It turns out that Susan was basically bullied by Geddes into sending Emily a letter, and I think Emily produces the letter now. I don't know if audiences in 1941 would have known what a rough business politics was. I said it might be friendlier in those days. Maybe that was just on the surface. Maybe this is a bit of an insight into how it actually works, but it's a ruthless business. Probably got even more ruthless now. I think it's just taken for granted now, isn't it, that candidates are more than happy to get personal with their opponents. Now, a little side note here, Ruth Warwick, who plays Emily, and Dorothy Comingore, who plays Susan, so the 2 Kane wives, were both pregnant at this time. Don't think Orson had anything to do with either of those pregnancies. And this is the only scene where they're actually together. Geddes threatens to blackmail Kane. Emily leaves. This is very interesting here. This is a crucial thing. Kane stays and refuses to drop out of the election, gambling on the love of the people at the expense of the welfare of his son. And he says there's only one person who's going to decide what I'm going to do, and that's me. And I'm thinking Charles Foster Kane is saying that, but I feel like Orson Welles could be saying that in reality as well. Geddes says,
If anybody else that'd say what's going to happen to you, it'd be a lesson to you. Only you're going to need more than one lesson. And you're going to get more than one lesson.
So he's offering him a little bit of insight into what Kane is actually like. Kane screams as Geddes is leaving with Emily as well.
Don't worry about me. I'm Charles Foster Kane. I'm no cheap, crooked politician trying to save himself from the consequences of his crimes. Geddes! I'm going to send you to Sing Sing! Sing Sing, Geddes!
This is where Wells stumbled. As I said earlier, fell 10 feet, breaking his ankle. Now, we get another trick that's typical of this film. It's been used a few times. The number 185 on the flat door, Susan's flat, now becomes part of a photo in the paper for the next scene. So essentially that's the opposite of what they did earlier with that photo of the Chronicle staff, where the photo became real life. This is the opposite now. Interesting newspaper headline, the next scene from the Chronicle, Kane caught in love nest with singer, in inverted commas. The public scandal ends his political career. Now Bernstein chooses the headline, Fraud at the Polls, for the Inquirer. He's obviously not going to mention Kane and Susan. Next scene, it's early the next morning, and we hear this beautifully wistful, I think it's an accordion, sounds like that, a version of the Kane song that we heard earlier that he was dancing to, evoking happier times. We get a low angle shot, very low angle. This was the one for which the trench was built. I talked about, when I was talking about the production of the film, drunk and now disillusioned Leland arrives and confronts Kane about his motives and abandonment of his principles. He says to him, "You talk about the people as if you own them. You want to persuade people that you love them so much that they ought to love you back. Only you want love on your own terms." And this is all giving the sense that Kane is all about acquisition, ownership, control. Leland asks for a transfer to Chicago, which Kane eventually grants. Now, Joseph Cotton is playing drunk here. He wasn't drunk for the scene, apparently, but he was tired because he had to finish his scenes. This may have actually been the last scene that he filmed for Citizen Kane. He had to rush off to join a theatre run of the Philadelphia story with Katharine Hepburn. He flubs a line here. He's supposed to say criticism and he says chromatism. And what actually happened, if you watch it closely, Orson Welles smiles when he says this. And Leland, who's already said to Kane, "I'm drunk," he says, "I am drunk." So he ad-libs a line, gets himself out of trouble. And Orson Welles, instead of saying cut, just decided to let it run, which was definitely a good idea. Kane has a drink with him, and we get another quite famous line. Kane offers a toast.
To love on my terms. Those are the only terms anybody ever knows. His own.
Now, something I talked about when I talked about the newsreel right at the beginning of the film. We learned in that newsreel, and I'm not sure that first-time viewers of the film would have picked up on it completely because there's such a bombardment of information in that scene, that Emily and their son died in a car crash about 2 years after they broke up. Now, I'm just wondering why that's never mentioned, because you would think that the tragic death of his son and his ex-wife, that would be a perfect part of the unfolding tragedy of Kane's life, but it's not mentioned. That's quite puzzling to me. Maybe there's just too much already. Now, I think in the story, Kane marries Susan almost as soon as his divorce has come through. We see them coming back from getting married, and they're all smiles. But really, this is one of the last times that you ever see Kane happy, and Susan for that matter. So he launches her as an opera singer. Maybe a few years later, for which she had neither the talent nor the ambition, Kane arranges for a large opera house to be built in Chicago for Susan to perform in. This was mentioned in the newsreel right at the beginning to have cost $3 million. So think about that. I guess we're in about the 1910s, are we? Something like that. $3 million then. I mean, that's a fortune now, but that's an incredible sum back then. And he's doing what a lot of rich parents do, really, which is using their money to help their children. And in this case, I'd say his intentions are good, but the element of control is there. And in the worst case scenario, the parents try and guilt their children if they don't let them have that control and don't do what they want. I mean, Kane's marriage trajectory has a kind of logic. I mean, he married Emily, and as we said before, two beautiful people, if you think of it like that, attractive and doing well in their lives. And when that soured, he fell for a much younger woman, and he plays this kind of parental role. He's 30 years older than her, after all. And I don't think we hear much about her family, but you get the idea that maybe she comes from a broken home, and maybe she's quite a naive person. I mean, she's only 21 anyway, but perhaps even naive for her age. She's quite childlike. And as Kane said in the scene where they originally met, we're both lonely. So it has a certain logic to it. After they've gone off for their honeymoon, there's another headline: Kane marries Singer, and Singer is still in inverted commas. And now we get this absolutely chaotic scene of panic as Susan is about to perform at the Chicago Opera House. She looks overawed, she looks out of her depth, and now we get the introduction of just a fantastic character, and a fantastic performance. The singing teacher is supposed to be Italian, Signor Matiste. He's actually played by a Spanish actor called Rotunno Bonanova, who was a baritone singer as well as a film, theatre and television actor. So he knows his stuff both with acting and music. We get this famous camera pan right up. It's a famous shot that was apparently an idea of one of the crew members, to two of these stagehands, and one holds his nose in disgust at her singing. I want to pose a question again. I'd like to know if anyone has any feedback about this. Is her singing that bad, or is it just that top-level opera singing is so precise and high-level that anything less than perfect is obvious? When I was talking about the music, Bernard Herrmann essentially composed, if not a complete opera, then a long piece of music, and there's this famous high D that was too high for the woman who was dubbing the singing for Dorothy Comingore. But I just want to talk about this character, Signor Matiste. These wild eyes he's got. He's very, very passionate, and his voice is fantastic, and it just fits this feeling of panic. It's almost like they're having a last-minute backstage rehearsal before she goes on. Now, Bernstein has become kind of a sycophant, really, at this point, and from here, really, it's all about Kane denying reality, and his cronies, if you want to call them that, including Bernstein, have to go along with this denial of reality. So Bernstein's applauding wildly, and Kane's other minions, if you want to call it that, they're propping up this idea that Susan is a top singer, and it's a sort of forced optimism almost. All the Inquirer notices are positive, not surprisingly, except Leland, who is doing the dramatic notice. So if you remember, he asked for a transfer to Chicago, which is where this opera house is. Leland is passed out drunk over his typewriter. Bernstein reads the unfinished notice to Kane. We find out also that Kane and Leland haven't spoken for a number of years, I guess since the transfer to Chicago.
Miss Susan Alexander, a pretty but hopelessly incompetent amateur, last night opened the new Chicago Opera House in a performance of... I still can't pronounce that name, Mr. Kane. Her singing happily is no concern of this department. Of her acting, it is absolutely impossible to...
Go on.
That's all there is.
Kane laughs at the review and dictates the rest of it in the same tone. So he's not changing it to a positive review. He's continuing it as a negative review. But you get the idea, is he doing this trying to prove to himself that he's still honest and that he's interested in reality? And then we get a close-up of the typewriter keys. And again, this was taken up by a director in New Hollywood 35 years later, All the President's Men. There's the exact same shot of typewriter keys. Leland wakes up while Kane is typing, and then Kane just says to him, "You're fired." And that's the first words they've spoken to each other for a number of years. Now, with this Kane typing shot, we've got Kane typing on the left-hand screen. This was done first with the right-hand side of the screen blank, and then Leland, also Bernstein right at the back, but it's basically Leland, was shot on the right screen with the left screen black, and then an optical printer that I mentioned earlier put all these shots together. Quite revolutionary for its day. And then we get a nice dissolve, which is Kane now typing on the right-hand side of the screen, and present-day Leland as an old man in a retirement home on the left. Hope you're keeping up. Leland continues this theme of Kane, he calls him Charlie, basically deluding himself. He says Charlie was always trying to prove something. He does mention, again, being a bit conciliatory. He does regret not answering his letters, so we get this idea that Kane did write to him a few times. The reporter goes back to see Susan. I mentioned earlier, I was saying about with the El Rancho scenes, that this famous shot coming down into the nightclub, and a variation of it was in fact used in both of the scenes. We're back in the present now. So now Susan is happy to talk to Thompson, and now she flashes back, and this is really a flashback from her for most of the rest of the film in this marvellously weird story structure. A little bit of trivia, the piano being played in that scene is actually being played by a 23-year-old Nat King Cole. You can't see him, but you can hear him. And now we cut back to the brilliant Signor Matiste trying to teach her to sing. He's basically being very well paid to do the impossible, but he's worried about his reputation. He actually says that he'll be a laughingstock. Doing that singing teacher thing of treating her delicately, saying, "Mrs. Kane, darling," and then singing the instructions to her, "From the diaphragm, you're out of pitch," that kind of thing.
Il mio cor, don't forget ta 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 ta. Oh, don't get nervous. Please, let's come back. Da capo, eh? Please look at me, Mrs. Kane, darling. Now, get the voice out of the throat. Play the tone right in the mask. Forward. The eyes. Go ahead. Diaphragm. Now. You're out of pitch.
And then he has a killer line.
Some people can sing, some can't. Impossible.
And that sums it up. I think she can sing, but some people can sing professionally and some can't. And you can't create it. You can take raw talent and develop it, but you can't. If the raw talent isn't there, it's very, very hard to coax it out. Kane has been watching, so this is all happening in Xanadu, and confronts Signor Matiste, basically ordering him to continue the tutoring.
It's not your job to give Mrs. Kane your opinion of her talents. You're supposed to train her voice, Signor Matiste. Please sit down and continue with the lesson.
But Mr. Kane, I will be the laughingstock of the musical world. People will think that
People will think. You're concerned with what people will think, but perhaps I can enlighten you, Signor Matiste. I'm something of an authority on what people will think. The newspapers, for example. I run several newspapers between here and San Francisco. It's all right, darling. Signor Matiste is going to listen to reason, aren't you, Signor Matiste?
But how can I persuade you?
You can't.
There's a great comedic moment where she hits this awful high note, this D, and Matiste looks at Kane to see his response, and Kane sort of smiles / grimaces.
I thought you'd see it my way.
Next scene is Susan performing again in Chicago, and we basically get another last-minute rehearsal and a panic, but like last time, but probably even more frenetic, in fact. And once again, Signor Matiste is just like wild-eyed, just trying to desperately make something happen, worried about his reputation. I should also mention that Susan is required to act. You're also required to act in an opera. I don't really know what opera acting is supposed to be, but the idea is that she's an okay actress, but similar to her singing. It's not terrible, but it's not great. Bernstein's falling asleep. Leland looks very bored and he's cutting up bits of newspaper. An audience member says, "Dreadful," which Kane hears, and he's wearing this sort of pained expression on his face. As the performance ends, there's scattered applause. And then as that dies down, Kane stands up and applauds loudly, now in complete denial of reality. And, it brings up the question, can powerful, rich and famous people ever stay in touch with reality? Some do a better job of it than others. Some seem to exist in this completely other world. That's a question to ponder. Next scene, Susan expresses her anger to Kane about the negative reviews. They're in this huge living room. There's papers spread out all over the floor. Dorothy Comagore does a great job here of conveying anger, and Kane basically gets an earful from her for the rest of the film, essentially.
Stop telling me he's your friend. Friend don't write that kind of review. All these other papers pounding me, I could expect that. But for the Enquirer to run a thing like that, spoiling my whole debut. Come in.
I'll get it.
Friend. Not the kind of friends I know. But of course I'm not high class like you, and I never went to any swell school.
That'll be enough, Susan. Yes?
Mr. Leland, sir.
Leland?
Jed Leland?
He wanted me to make sure that you got this personally.
Thanks, Phil.
Yes, sir.
Is that something from him? As for you, You ought to have your head examined. Sending him a letter telling him he's fired with a $25,000 check in it. What kind of firing do you call that? You did send him a check for $25,000, didn't you?
Then Kane gets some posts, and it's the original Declaration of Principles, described by Kane as an antique, posted to him by Leland. Susan wants to quit, but Kane insists that she carry on with her singing. And crucially, he says, I don't propose to have myself made ridiculous. We then get a montage of Susan performing, and there's newspaper headlines superimposed onto the screen. Next scene, Kane breaks into Susan's room and she's attempted suicide with pills. The doctor says she'll be fine. Kane insists that it was a mistake. So he's denial of reality again. His pride is too much to believe that any wife of his would want to end her life. Susan awakens looking very drawn and explains that she attempted suicide because of the ridicule of her singing. Kane finally agrees to let her stop performing. Now there's a little note here. Orson Welles, according to one book I read, apparently treated Dorothy Common-Gore terribly and almost made her hate him. And he would claim that he was doing this deliberately to make her performance better. She needed to absolutely hate Kane by the end. This is something we've seen in many other films. If you read about the production of a film or watch a documentary, a very famous case was Jaws. Robert Shaw and Richard Dreyfuss apparently didn't get on well. Shaw was always needling Dreyfuss, perhaps jealous that he was younger, and the idea was that Quint, Robert Shaw's character, has a bit of a needle with Hooper, Dreyfuss's character. In the film, they're basically old school and modern. Hooper wants to use what's the technology of the day, which is a shark cage and basically pumping poison into the shark. And Quint just wants to use barrels and a harpoon. But who knows? I always feel that maybe, it's pretty stressful making films, I imagine, and probably there's a bit of both. I hate to always say that. It's a bit boring, isn't it? I feel like I'm sitting on the fence, but I think they probably realise it's good for the character, but kind of think, well, maybe if you're Robert Shaw, maybe he was a drinker as well, and maybe Richard Dreyfuss's youth annoys you, or you think he's a bit lazy and he's not using his talent, whatever it is. And you think, well, that'd be good for the character, but I'll kind of get it off my chest as well. That's how that thing happens. Right, I'm going to leave it there in terms of the plot for part 4. So part 5 will finish off this plot, and then we'll have a few final reflections. Just to reflect on the story that's gone so far, it's worth pondering, I suppose, how much do any of us want to accept our own reality? I'm sure we are all deluding ourselves to some extent. I'm getting into life and life-only territory here. See, it all connects. My 3 podcasts, they all kind of connect with each other in a roundabout way. Perhaps the pride that Kane is feeling, the excessive pride, there's a famous expression, isn't there? Pride comes before a fall. Maybe it's just magnified because he's more powerful and richer and more famous. So maybe we've all got it, but when he's put in that position, it's magnified and it all seems worse. And it all kind of is worse in a way. But look at it another way. He probably does believe that she could be an opera singer. That's the thing. I don't think he's being deceptive to her. I think he's just deceiving himself. He's fooling himself. So with his sincere belief, let's call it that, it's very frustrating. He's thinking, I've got all this money, this power, but I can't make this happen. You can't get blood out of a stone. And Signor Matista has basically laid it out for him. You've got it or you haven't got it. I'm sure if she had a bit more of a voice, he could probably turn her into something great, but he can't. I don't think he knows Kane is in the room when he's saying, you're out of pitch, and some people can sing, some can't. Kane then appears, or you hear his voice. Sorry, we've seen him, and he's in the background, then you hear his voice. But yeah, that's it. I was listening last year to a podcast by Robert Greene. His most famous book is The 48 Laws of Power, but I've read all of his books so far. And he said on a podcast something that really has stuck with me since last year when I heard it, that reality is the best thing you've got. Even if your reality is not great, denying it makes it worse. So the best thing you've got is your reality. The other point to make is it great to have loads of money and loads of power and loads of fame? Now, in a famous British sitcom, one of the characters says, being rich might not be all great, but it takes the sting out of being poor. I'm not going to say that it's better to be poor than rich. That seems a little bit naive. I think it's probably better to be somewhere in the middle. You know, it's nice to be financially comfortable, but I think with great power or riches probably does come delusion built in with it. Possibly a lot of it to do with the way that people treat you. On that philosophical note, I'm going to bring an end to part 4. If you would like to help out the podcast or my podcast work in general, there are links in the show notes to PayPal and Buy Me a Coffee. You can make one-off donations, don't need to make a subscription, and it will just keep the proverbial lights on and keep me motivated to pump out these podcasts. And I will see you very soon for part 5, which will be the last part of our deep dive into Citizen Kane. So for now, thanks for listening, take care of yourselves, and goodbye.
The entire premise of Citizen Kane is to uncover the story behind tycoon Charles Foster Kane's last word, Rosebud. Indeed, the young Charles is seen having fun with Rosebud the very day he is told that as a result of his mother coming into considerable wealth, his future care and education are to be entrusted to a total stranger, with the purpose of equipping him for a better life, though at the expense of the care, love, nurturing, stability and reassurance his parents might have provided. Rosebud represents, therefore, Kane's youthful innocence, idealism, trust, hope and potential, all suddenly diverted or redirected in the name of a more successful future. As time goes by, and in the absence of parental affection, concern and advice, and doubtless bolstered by the reassurance of financial security and feeling no pressure to make a living or comply with standards and regulations, Kane displays little prudence and recognises no need to behave responsibly as he is expelled from a variety of schools, and he confronts self-fulfilment but without the concept of integrity or altruism. Seemingly to his great credit, he finds purpose and direction when he buys a failing newspaper in which he proudly declares his principles, to be truthful to his readers and to campaign on behalf of the underprivileged. While this declaration of apparent integrity is worthy, we are also aware of a willingness to apply manipulation and cunning to pursue broader aims and ambitions as he develops his newspaper empire by way of sensationalism and unfounded opinion pieces, allowing him to establish and expand social and personal influence. He is willing to subsidise his paper with his personal fortune. However, it becomes clear that this may be viewed as an investment in his own future, as his editorial influence will eventually translate into aspirations toward political power when he sets his sights on becoming governor, and perhaps then president. Out of the blue, we learn that he is to marry the niece of the president. It becomes clear, however, that his relationship with Emily takes second place to the exercise of influence and the seeking of power, and this is brilliantly captured in the film by the ever-increasing distance and ever-deteriorating atmosphere between Kane and his wife at the breakfast table. It may be that each seeks to profit by the other's position and political ambition. Each may have been dazzled by the prospect of social and political advancement, but each is disappointed by the lack of personal fulfilment in the relationship. The marriage, like the newspaper empire, may have been something of a facade to cover broader ambitions. This may go some way to explaining Kane's attraction to Susan, a relatively simple but sincere failing singer. She is natural and she seems to like Kane for himself, as she doesn't know of him. She is easy to get on with, and they appear to have a genuine bond of friendship and mutual appreciation, as Kane offers to help her with singing lessons. However, Kane's political ambitions and his marriage are brought to an end by sensation-driven press coverage of Kane and Susan's friendship, sponsored by Kane's opponent for the governorship. Kane marries Susan, but is determined to transform her singing career into something worthy, but also, more importantly, into a source of pride for him. Despite evidence of Susan's limited singing ability and her own feelings of inadequacy, Kane has an entire opera house built around her talent. Perhaps he aspires to social and cultural worth and standing, but in personalising the construction of the opera house to promote his wife's career and his own status, he is indulging in another sham which is doomed to failure. It is at this point that he finally loses the friendship of his old ally Jed Leland. Jed embarks on a review of Susan's performance while she's on tour, but he drinks himself into a stupor while writing and falls asleep before completing it. Kane reads what he has written and finishes it for him, giving a balanced, fair and damning review of his wife's performance. He recognises a truth, but refuses to accept it. By now, corrupted by ego-driven desires fueled by sufficient wealth to engender a feeling of entitlement, Kane will fire his friend Jed for refusing to twist events to suit his desired image of them, and at the same time will do away with whatever vestiges of integrity he had left. He will also push Susan to her limit and beyond, before seeing things from another's point of view, and conceding that ambition and means are not enough to guarantee success. Yet his wife Susan wants to leave him because he fails to understand that giving her things and a palatial home are no substitute for taking a genuine interest in her. All he has built is hollow, a setting with no substance. He aspires to greatness and perhaps a place in history, but he fails to realise that a legacy of worth is often born of humanity, warmth, hope and principle, and tributes or monuments are only of worth if undertaken in honour of another. Perhaps Charles Foster Kane was deprived of the avenue of true greatness when his mother and he became fabulously wealthy and his life was redirected on the path of perceived success. And while he certainly garnered money and the trappings of success, and attracted notoriety, he remained fundamentally unfulfilled.